Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of A Mic on the Podium with me, Michael Seal. Today, I conduct a conversation with a Welsh conductor who shot to fame when he won the Leeds conducting competition in 1986. He has had a long and distinguished career, holding title positions in Belgium, Norway, France, the United States, and the United Kingdom. He has also had to go through the arduous task of learning to conduct again after suffering a stroke in 2021. It's a great pleasure to welcome Grant Llewellyn. Grant, it is very, very, very nice to meet you today. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you very much for asking. As somebody who's listened to a couple of episodes, you know that I always go right back to the beginning. And you may also know that I do a lot of stuff, research on Wikipedia and your own website or your agent's website. And I can find nothing really before the Leeds conducting competition. So do you come from a musical family? What were your earliest musical experiences, instruments and the such?
Okay, well, I've got 25 years to fill in.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
I come from a large family of 4 boys, and in southwest Wales in Pembrokeshire, that means a pretty boisterous affair. Rugby, football, cricket, musical instruments in the shape of a piano at home and 2 parents who sang very enthusiastically, a grandmother who played keyboard pretty badly, but she was very cuddly, and so we were happy to sit on her lap as she vamped through Victoriana.
Yeah.
My younger brothers, I'm the second of 4. My 2 younger brothers followed me in pursuit of the cello and double bass and the piano. But I really took off with the piano in the wake of my grandmother's enthusiasm, which occurred 5 or 6. I think I started formal lessons at 6, and then the cello later at 9. But I think you have to put all that in the context of the South Wales tradition of and love of music making socially, publicly, in church, in school, at the rugby club, wherever you were. There was a chance that at any given moment we would break into song.
Yeah.
Sounds rather romantic, but it still happens. And so there was a lot of music in the air, and I sort of grabbed it with both hands through the cello and the piano, and the early change to my whole existence and life was my mother and father seeing a documentary on Chetham's School of Music. And that was, it must have been 1969, I suppose, or 70. So I was 10. And I had the offer of going to Manchester to audition for this music school. And I didn't give it a second thought, really. I just took it as it came. I was pretty happy-go-lucky about everything. And it was just an excuse to get to Manchester. I'd never been to Manchester from South West Wales. And in fact, get a chance to go and see Manchester United train. It was me. And my dad and I we went down to the training ground in Salford, and saw a few of the names that I knew, and it was exhilarating and thrilling. And apparently I did an audition sometime as well. So I was duly offered a place at Chetham's and a local education authority grant in those days. Now it's direct grant. So I wasn't sure that I'd get the money. But well, lo and behold, I found myself in a grimy industrial northern city centre, coming from a idyllic, bucolic southwest Wales countryside, effectively, near Tenby. Once there, again, I didn't reflect on it very much. I don't think I was a particularly reflective boy at that age. Always looking forward to the next challenge, the next opportunity, and I kind of got on with life amongst 250 specialist musicians, and they became increasingly specialized as I was there. I think I might have been the second or third year of intake.
Yes.
So it was early days, and there was a sort of crossover between the day boys, the Mancunians, who tend to be less musical and more sporty, which suited me fine, and the real specialists who came from further and further afield to board.
Yeah. There's an important question right now, which is, it's going to hang over this entire conversation unless I ask it right at this moment. Are you still a Manchester United fan? Because I am, and Daniel Harding is.
Well, yes, I'm pleased to hear it. I wasn't a Manchester United fan even then.
Oh, right, okay.
I have always been a Tottenham Hotspur fan. As the family, my mother is from the East End of London, and her father supported Spurs, and so we had no choice. And I've lived to regret every minute. No.
But I mean, in 1970, if you went to watch training of Manchester United, you were probably going to see through a fence Best, Law and Charlton, which were the sort of pop star footballers of their day. I mean, I know we're getting off conducting, but you know, it's an interesting time in the sporting world.
Very, very important. And you know, I say I was not a Manchester United fan. Hey, every other week of the Saturday, it was either Old Trafford or Main Road, if I was free. So I became a Manchester United City fan. But back in the day, United were preeminent and were pretty dominant, and City were the poor relations back then. They had a few good years, and I was there through the 70s at Chetham's, and as I became more involved in concerts and the music, choirs and orchestras, Saturday tended to be taken up with concert work. But whenever I could, I got along to watch them.
So when, I'm assuming it would be at Chetham's, we're in such a rich musical environment. As you said, it got richer through the 70s and became what it is today, a specialist music school. I'm assuming conducting first appeared for you there in some way or other, though I know, of course, that they don't specifically teach conducting. But I wonder, was it there that it first piqued to your interest?
Well, yes, back then they actually did start a formal conducting class. When I was 14, 15, Nicholas Smith, who was the conductor of the Northern Chamber Orchestra, I think, and conducted various school ensembles, he did take us for a few rudimentary classes. But no, I learnt on the job, as we do, by putting groups of friends together, persuading them to give up, their Sundays, and we make music, and we, find out what was in the library, and it would be anything from a Metamorphosen to Carousel, as the parts were available. And I undoubtedly learnt more from playing cello under some significant conductors. The school orchestra played with James Lochran and John Henry Gardner in those early days, Tim Renish, and of course Michael Brewer, who was the director of music at the time, and I learned so much, especially about choral technique, from him. So it was a rich environment, and there was some formal, beat pattern classes and instrumentation, score reading. But you tended to have to do that if you were playing in orchestra anyway.
Yeah.
Especially when one progressed to the front of a section, it was expected that you'd have a miniature score, and you'd find out what was happening.
And so on to, we would call it further and higher education. I don't know what it's called now. Where did you study, and what did you study?
Right. Well, I took a choral exhibition audition at Cambridge in my sixth form, and I applied to do music at university, thinking that it would keep more options open longer. I was an okay cellist. I was not gonna set the world alight on the cello. I don't know, I may have been able to hold down a job. I probably would have, with work and application. Anyway, I was awarded a choral scholarship, and I got an exhibition to read music at Common Keys College, Cambridge, which I deferred a year, taking a year off, as they called it then. And I traveled to Italy, where I had some private cello lessons and chamber music classes at the Conservatorio di Francesco Morlacchi in Perugia, and in Santa Cecilia in Rome. But it was a fabulous year. I wasn't attending regular classes at either one place, and I played as much football as I did, frankly, the cello. In fact, I earned a lot more money playing football than I did playing the cello. But it was a year where I sort of came to terms with the cello. I practiced more than I ever had before, and I decided on the strength of it that I would go up to university and concentrate on conducting. So it was a conscious decision to neglect the cello somewhat. Well, I didn't neglect it. I played like I always had in many concerts, but I favoured the idea of conducting. It was little more than an idea at that point, but I'd done a little bit.
But you were at Cambridge, so it was a fertile music environment, and therefore, you can do as you've been doing at Chetham's and form groups and sort of get your hands wet.
Exactly, and in the first year, I was learning the ropes and playing the cello a fair amount, and I had even song to sing 5 times a week, and each college, of which there are about 30 or so, had its own societies, orchestras, choirs, opera society, as well as the university-based groups. So there was tons of music going on, and it was question of trying to play the field and decide which would be most beneficial and rewarding. And so starting off fairly small within the college, I then expanded to the University Opera Society and the University Music Society Orchestra in my second and third years.
We're just about to come on to four of the biggest names I could ever think of in the conducting world who mentored you at Tanglewood in America. But before we go to Tanglewood, were you having any lessons at Cambridge, any private lessons with any conducting teachers, people, or somebody you could go and speak to, a mentor or somebody whose advice you could seek?
The conductors whom we enjoyed were largely music directors at one or other college, chapel. So Stephen Cleary, of course, at King's, and Philip Ledger before him, and George Guest at St John's College, Cambridge. Richard Marlowe was a wonderful choral conductor at Trinity. So there weren't symphonic conductors to learn from, alas. But, in a sense, it gave us the freedom to conduct our Mahler symphonies if you had the wherewithal to motivate other students, and Puccini operas and Stravinsky, the Rake's Progress I did, and the Opera Society there. We were crazily ambitious, and I can't imagine. I've just done the Rake's Progress again, and I cannot imagine what it must have sounded like back then. But it was, a fully fledged production in the Arts Theatre in Cambridge, and somehow or other we sold tickets to the public, and it was a great, very steep learning curve. But the shock to the system was postgraduate at the Royal College of Music with Norman Delmar. Certainly did not suffer fools, and he didn't take any prisoners. And you might well have conducted Mahler at Cambridge, but this was the real world that he was preparing us for. And I spent 2 years with him, and it was tremendous. First and foremost, his utterly sincere and profound music making. But he always backed that up with, I would say, what's the right word? A forensic, I suppose, knowledge of the score and scores, music history. His book, The Anatomy of the Orchestra, was our sort of Bible. And as I say, quite a few of us fell by the wayside. I almost said, well, I enjoyed my 2 years there, but it was really, really tough and exacting, but rewarding. And I followed Norman Delmar with the four people whom you're referring to.
Well, yes. So, how do we go from Norman Delmar, who's appeared in previous episodes, Simon Halsey, for instance, right back in episode 9, he studied with Norman Delmar. But how do we go from there to the Boston Symphony Orchestra's summer home of Tanglewood, and the four names I was going to mention that you mentioned as mentors, you cannot get much bigger than Seiji Ozawa, Kurt Masur, Andre Previn, and of course, it being Tanglewood, Leonard Bernstein. So how do you get from the Royal College of Music to a leafy suburb outside Boston?
So Tanglewood back then was, I reckon, probably the preeminent summer program for conductors. Aspen were sort of on the radar, but not quite at the same level. So, you know, as a postgraduate conductor, I knew it was the place to go if one could get on the fellowship program. They have a seminar conducting program, but then they took 2 or 3 fellows each year, which was the thing to do.
Yeah.
But in order to get on that, one would have to go to Boston and audition, which was a tall order. But I got support from the English-speaking union, and bless them, they helped me one January day go to Boston in the snow and the ice, and at Symphony Hall under the gaze of Seiji Ozawa and crew. Again, it was, I suppose there may have been 10 or 15 of us, probably more, 15 at least, auditioning. And you will know the format. It was Stravinsky, L'Histoire du Soldat, and Beethoven 2, and Rossini, La Scala di Seta, and Tchaikovsky, Violin Concerto. You know, things that would reveal pretty immediately whether you knew your stuff and could handle a smaller version of what was the Boston Symphony on stage. It was all pretty harrowing, but when I think back, those were the days when you were doing auditions every week and, you know, in the groove, and conducting auditions are anything but a perfect science. So you kind of took what came your way and tried not to worry about it if it didn't, but things happened to plan, and I was fortunately offered one of the fellowships and went back in the summer. It was the summer following my second postgraduate year at the college. And yes, Masur, Previn, you know, they could have gone on to include Simon Rattle and Charles Dutoit and Michael Tilton Thomas, and you know, it was an extraordinary few weeks where you were bombarded with personality after personality. But interestingly, in the conducting classes, at least, you confronted these people with some of the same repertoire. And I mentioned Beethoven 2, which was a standard piece for the summer. And watching these great names flounder in the introduction every bit as much as we did was somehow enlightening and reassuring. And in between the floundering, you know, there was examples of supreme technique, mostly from Seiji Ozawa. I'd say he was preeminent in just his ability to show the music. Previn, not so hot on technique. Wonderful when he sat down at the keyboard. Kurt Masur was intimidating. and very unclear. Conducting without a baton, which in his case I don't think helped clarity, but all these little things. And then Bernstein waltzed into town. He came in open top Mercedes Maestro 1 number plate, wearing outrageous chintzy bomber jackets, and followed by at least 2 television crews pretty much everywhere he went. And he obviously adored the attention, and could have been easily dismissed as superficial, a prima donna. Par exemple, absolutely right down to his last atom, except that as soon as you were working with him, and it could have been in a room, well, it invariably was, packed to the rafters with hangers on and television crews and people photographing left, right, and center. He had an incredible ability, which I have to say, I'm sure was sincere, to engage you and only you on whatever it was you were talking about. And, he and I, we spent one session on the opening of Brahms. Well, it was down as Brahms 4, but we spent about three quarters of an hour on the first 8 bars.
Wow.
How you prepare that orchestra for that upbeat. And then what happens after that upbeat? And he went off at various tangents, as he could do like no other. And, I felt obviously the charisma of the man, but also the greatness of the communicator. And I came to see that on many occasions at Tanglewood and since. It was an incredible mind and personality in tandem. So I think with Bernstein and Ozawa, who in its sense was the antithesis of Len Bernstein, in that he didn't talk very much. He didn't have that much English, but he had the most extraordinary conducting technique. And I learned more from watching him than anybody, undoubtedly anybody, and was lucky enough to go back invited back as his assistant, probably 5 years, 4 or 5 years after that.
Well, we're going to come on to that because on a previous episode, I'm afraid, what would I call him? A partner in crime of yours, Robert Spano, talked about a couple of wonderful years you spent together sharing the assistant conducting role. You're smiling and nodding your head, which is a good sign. I'm going to go briefly back to Bernstein and rubber stamp what you just said with the story from our dear departed Bram Tovey, who died earlier this year, who talked about standing in for Bernstein, standing in for a concert that Bernstein was going to attend, and Bernstein appearing at the back of the Barbican, again with a film crew following him, smoking everywhere that he went. He said, but the minute he stood next to me and gave me advice about conducting Bernstein's music, he said, I was the only person in the room. He said, and that was the most important thing. All of the other side issues, the camera crews, the lighting, the whatever else, that had all been jettisoned, and he was there purely to help Bram out in what Bram was doing. And so it sounds like, yeah, as you said, he enjoyed the trappings of his lifestyle, but it seemed like, when he needed to be a teacher or a mentor, he was 100% involved in doing that.
Absolutely. I think my first encounter with him was during a concert that I was conducting, and I was on the rostrum conducting Brahms. What was it? Oh, there was the Haydn Variations, and he appeared in the wings of the hall whilst I was conducting. And again, he was wearing a Lakers bomber jacket, which was gold lame, and he was just about visible enough for all the orchestra and pretty much all the audience to spot him. He just arrived in a blaze of glory at Tanglewood. And I had to finish the performance and go off stage into his arms before coming back to take a bit, because he was all about the tactile, and he said, "Oh, I could have taught you so much." I just finished the performance, but during the following few weeks, he really did, and we'll never see anyone quite like that. Sure.
Before we go back to Boston, 1 year after you'd been to Tanglewood in 85, in 86, you enter the Leeds conducting competition, which was, I suppose by now, this was the third time it had been run. And I've interviewed the other two who won it before you, Sean Edwards and Martin Brabbins. What do you remember about entering that and winning, and the aftermath and the aftercare? Did it, really set you off on your journey to become a conductor? And did you get any aftercare?
Well, it was another example of, an audition, conducting audition, this time competition, that you took or left. I seem to remember I didn't get too worked up about it. In fact, it was all very last minute because my application had not been successful. And being a conductor, I was put out why they accepted me. I'd just come back from Tanglewood and been a conducting fellow at the Royal College, and apparently a prerequisite was submission of a couple of referees, which I had given them. I can't remember, Norman Del Mar and Seiji Ozawa or somebody, but they wanted the actual references rather than just the referees.
They wanted a written document signed by, yeah.
Anyway, I was a reserve, and I only heard that I was going to go to Leeds the week before. And so I sort of had nothing to lose, in that the repertoire was, for the first couple of rounds, fairly standard. It were including L'après-midi d'un faune, which I knew quite well. But then I sort of hoped I didn't get through to the final, because the final concert was really obscure. It was Shostakovich 6, Mattis de Mahler, Hindemith, and Vaughan Williams 6.
Oh, wow. Wow, that, as you said, obscure. I mean, possibly the Shostakovich would have been the most well-known, but amongst Shostakovich symphonies, even that, most conductors will have learned 1, 5, 10.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
When I learned that I was in the final with two others, I had to very quickly learn Vaughan Williams' Sixth Symphony, which I had been assigned. You do things, burn the candle as necessary, and it worked out. Now, at that time, I had received some interest from a manager, which was the next big hurdle.
Mm.
And he came to watch the final concert, and literally before I think I went up to receive the prize, had offered to represent me. Now, it was a renowned management, and I thought this is what I wanted all along. At that point, I pretty much received first invitations to conduct most British orchestras.
Yeah, yeah.
And in terms of follow-up care, you mentioned, I don't remember having any further contact with the Leeds competition as such. But I had this manager who looked after me very well, was very ambitious for me, perhaps in retrospect too ambitious. But I survived most of the first engagements and was invited back most places, and started to conduct abroad quite a bit at the time, in the former Soviet Union, which was interesting to me. But interestingly, when Seidozawa invited me back to Boston, it was very much disapproved of by my management. What, you're going to become an assistant conductor when you're a fully fledged conductor in your own right, And I said, well, as far as I was concerned, I still had plenty to learn, and I could think of nowhere better to do it than in Boston, the Boston Symphony, which I knew somewhat, and with Seidozawa, who had always been very generous, very giving, and very kind, which I thought would be a safe environment to be an assistant. And because there were two of us, me and Bob Spano, it meant that we would only have to be contracted in Boston for half the season. And I could pursue my freelance career back in Europe and who knows, elsewhere in the States. And that's how it worked out. The family came, we all went over to Boston for 4 years, and they were marvelous years. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you basically answered the question that was on the tip of my tongue, which was, if somebody, there's 8 years between us now, we're in our 50s and 60 years old. Nowadays, somebody who wins a competition, whether they would even entertain the thought of then going and being an assistant conductor after winning a competition and getting your first steps on the rung of a conducting career, let alone whether the management would agree to it, it would seem something that just wouldn't happen. but I know, because of the way that you've just spoken about Ozawa, Boston, and where you thought you were in your life, that you know that you did the right thing. I think I would agree with you. It's probably a brave decision to go against your management, but then you know what's right for you, and that's the whole point. You know how much you know or don't know. That's the important thing, isn't it?
Yes, and as a freelance conductor, as I was for 4 or 5 years, then you very rarely get close to an orchestra if you're doing one-off gigs here, there, and everywhere. And I repeatedly conducted some of the same orchestras, the BBC in Wales, the National Orchestra of Wales. I was getting to know with, spending 2 or 3 weeks each season.
Mm.
But really to get to know an orchestra from the inside, which I was able to do in Boston, get to know individuals, the strengths and how they operated. Some of the greatest orchestral players in the world, obviously, to be able to get that close to them was a treat, and something that I don't think as a conductor you often do. As an assistant conductor, it was possible.
Mm. No, I've said that on this, on this podcast on many occasions, that it's the way to get to know an orchestra, how it works, but to pick the brains of players. I was a violinist for 22 years professionally. There's not an awful lot about string playing that you can teach me about, orchestras, but it meant that I could go and ask, when I was conducting something and the bassoons always fluffed a bit, I could go and ask my friends in the bassoons, why is that difficult? And that's about as near as you're going to get as a conductor, being an assistant, to be able to go and stand in a coffee queue with the trumpets and ask about a chorale, or, the percussionist, and ask, why do you use that stick for that tam-tam note, or whatever. That's the only way you're going to be able to do it. And I think it's a brilliant thing to do if you can.
Yeah. And for me at that stage as well, we had a growing family, but they were still young. We went to Boston with 2 children, our 2 daughters, came back to Britain with 3, and added another one thereafter. So the family, which was crucially important, was able to make it work for them as well. So they were based in Boston, and as you say, its suburbs are very attractive and leafy, and we had a wonderful 4 years.
Now, my next question is basically with a foot either side of the Atlantic Ocean. Because if I reel off the places that you've had positions at, 3 years of principal guest conductor at the Stavanger Symphony Orchestra, 3 years as chief at the Antwerp Symphony Orchestra, then 5 years at Handel and Haydn Society in America, and from 2004 you were music director of the North Carolina Symphony Orchestra, and now you're music director laureate, and since 2014, music director of the Orchestra Nationale de Bretagne. Plus, of course, ever since those early days, you've had an association with the BBC National Orchestra of Wales, and even took them on tour to South America and Patagonia, which for the Welsh and the Patagonians was a big thing. I remember reading all about it and hearing about it on the BBC. My question is, your role as music director either side of the pond is obviously very different. Do you enjoy that extra thing that comes with being a music director in the United States, where it's not just about waving your arms around devising programs? It's about pressing the flesh of the local philanthropists, trying to convince people they need to invest in their local orchestra, versus Europe, where it is much more highfalutin and you're only thinking about the music and waving your arms around. How do you find, because you said to me off air you're basically spending half your time in North Carolina and the other half in France. So how do you cope, and do you enjoy the American side of it?
I did.
Right.
I was there for 16 years,
Yeah.
and that's a lot of flesh.
Yes.
Yes, I sort of bought into the whole scene out there because I knew that it was part and parcel of the life and the survival of any symphony orchestra. I'd seen it in Boston. So I went to North Carolina with my eyes open in that respect. And I think partly because it was a regional state orchestra that identified very much with the outlying areas of North Carolina. That part of the job was all important. Getting on the road, small towns in the Appalachian Mountains in one direction, along the outer banks, the coast in the other direction. And for me, that was a great attraction. We have a first-class concert hall in downtown Raleigh. And in addition, we had, I'd say, 10 satellite concert series around the whole state. And we would occasionally take tours for 2 weeks at a time out to the mountains. Yeah, it was a thrill for me to meet so many different people. And I grew to really appreciate the community role that a symphony performs and should perform. And we, probably more than any other American orchestra, had an extensive series of education concerts. And the musicians were really dedicated to them, and I appreciated that. So, yeah, that was North Carolina, 16 years. In France, they had a very different model, largely state-sponsored. Something like 90% of their income was provided for them. But in recent years have had to take something from, if you want, the philanthropy in the States, and they have an American New Yorker as the general manager. And we're really pushing the boat out in that respect. And so the friends of the Orchestre National de Bretagne are becoming more and more crucial and important there as well. And I have to say that now, post-pandemic and post-stroke, that has become something of a trial in France for me to perform. So much so that, you know, the orchestra has, I think, 4 different political levels of sponsorship. The politicians at the city level, at the metropolitan area, the province of Bretagne, and the state in Paris, and at every level there are politicians who want to be consulted and have a couple of hours of your time in very formal French, because there's a certain protocol, you can imagine, with the politicians. And that, for me, you know, no meeting lasts less than 2 hours, invariably 2.5 hours. And it's incredibly tiring now. My French is quite good, but it's a curious thing that since I had the stroke, I will occasionally start a sentence in French and finish it in Italian, because the Italian was there before the French, and the orchestra is completely bemused by this. But it's an interesting symptom.
Well, you mentioned the stroke, and I know it was last year, wasn't it? And I wonder whether you would mind, A, talking about it, but B, talking about how you've had to go through rehab and rehabilitation to be able to conduct again, and what that's meant now, conducting, compared to what it meant for the previous 58, 59 years. So please, if you wouldn't mind telling us about your stroke, which I'm sure is very harrowing, but I know you said to me it's important that we do talk about it.
Well, that's who I am now, and that's what I have to contend with, and what I have to offer, because I think it's opened up some new horizons and closed others. It's 2 years now since I had the stroke, and it was anything but a stroke, in the sense that it didn't happen suddenly. There was no shock, losing consciousness or anything like that. It was a maddening, gradual, over nearly 3 days, a loss of control of my right arm, my right leg, so that when I sort of bottomed out, I was completely paralyzed in that, and at that stage couldn't know what the future held. What no doctor was prepared to give a prognosis. There was a chance that I would recover some movement, but I think the writing was on the wall that it was unlikely that I'd get everything back. And that took at least 6 months for me to recover some control of arm and leg, so that I am now able to get around. I walk with some difficulty. The knee won't bend, the hamstrings don't work, the dorsiflexion muscle, which helps you lift your foot up, is weak, and I have some problem with the hip flexors. So, I can walk, but I use a stick mostly, but not on stage. And in fact, standing is probably more comfortable than walking. So I found that once I got to the rostrum, I was pretty much safe for the next couple of hours. But conducting, of course, and I'm right-handed, so conducting is all, for me, was all about the baton being controlled by the right hand and right arm, and that was showing the essential tempo of the music. So I had to face up to the fact that was not going to be the case. It wasn't going to be possible. I don't yet, I may never have sufficient control to use my right arm. It's improving. I can see there's some dexterity there, but as I say, not meaningful. So all of a sudden, I had the prospect of conducting just with my left hand, not using a baton because I have to turn pages occasionally as well. But essentially, this is all I have. And I must say that orchestras have been wonderfully generous so far, especially the orchestras. I know the Welsh, the French, the North Carolina. You know, when I get up on the rostrum, I don't feel inhibited at all. And I don't honestly feel musically limited. The physical, practical task of turning the pages is actually the most difficult moment, depending on the group and the music. You can sometimes turn the pages and the players will look up horrified that you stop beating time. Depending on the repertoire and, you know, the proficiency of the ensemble, which I've come to believe that it can actually be a good thing for everybody, that regularly during the conducting, I stop conducting. You know, it has everybody on the edge of their chairs a bit more, and needing to be self-sufficient, perhaps. But you know, you were an orchestral player and a string player, and you don't need every single beat or every single bar. And frankly, I probably, looking back, over-conducted many things, as I think we do. So now I'm much more trusting of the players, perhaps much more respectful of the players in some senses. And actually, I've come to think that, realize that I have a deeper respect for the music as well. So I'm probably not taking on so many challenges of new music, although I still conduct quite an amount, but I'm revisiting repertoire that I've conducted before a number of times, and I am enjoying it so much more. I'm finding the preparation is more in depth because, you know, conductors career around the place from one concert to another, from one orchestra to another, with a whole different program from week to week, and it's insane. And you know, I used to do it willingly and I enjoyably, I suppose, to a point, but now I'm having to slow down somewhat and well, I was going to say gone are the weeks in France, followed by a week in North Carolina, followed. The reason I laugh is I'm about to do just that. But I, you know, back in the day, it used to be a whole year of alternating transatlantic flights. And I think, well, I know it was too much.
Well, I want to say thank you for talking so openly about it, how harrowing it must have been. What's interesting is that you're already looking at it in such a positive light. Conducting one-handed, for instance, means, as you say, you have to stop conducting to turn the pages over. But then, when we were studying, or with whoever we were studying with, how many times were we told to put our left hand out, our non-beating hand in our pocket, and try and conduct one-handed and show everything that we could? I remember playing in a concert in Tokyo once, and we were doing Sibelius 2 with Sakura Oromo for the nth time. And halfway through the second movement, he just stopped using his left hand completely and then conducted one-handed for the rest of the movement. And I think almost the rest of the symphony. I went off stage and asked him what the problem was, and he said, "Oh, nothing. I just wondered whether I could conduct better with only one hand." And to try and give himself a technical challenge in a work that we'd all played and he conducted many, many, many times. So it can be done. I suppose leading on to my next question is going to be another practical point to do with your stroke. But thank you. I just want to say that now for speaking about it being so open and honest, and about how it happened and the future as well. Might I go on to the 11th question, because it's fresh in my mind. It's about score study, and I ask every conductor this, how you go about studying a score. And the question I always ask is, are you a scribbler in of markings and red, blue and black and whatever else? My question now is, were you a scribbler in right-handed of many things in your scores? But now I'm assuming you've had to learn to write left-handed, and has that impacted on your score studying and marking of scores?
Right. Well, beforehand, I was a marker in pencil. I hope not too heavily, of scores. As a student, much more so. And I became progressively less so as I grew up and knew the music better and felt I didn't need so many signposts. But I would mark certainly new repertoire up pretty assiduously. Even before the pandemic, before the stroke, I was favoring, especially with standard repertoire, often having a completely unscribbled score. And I would find myself with Beethoven Symphony, as long as I had the right edition, using completely new material. And I find that very refreshing. And certainly with certain repertoire, with concertos, which had particular idiosyncrasies, I'd have warning marks along the way. Now, I can't say I've had to learn to write again with the left hand, because one writes so little these days.
That's very true. We spend a lot of time tipping and tapping screens.
And tapping. So that's something that I've had to get used to, is tipping and tapping with the left hand. This morning, incidentally, it is my wife's birthday today. And so I found myself having to write a birthday card legibly. And it's improving. It was, she said, quite legible. But my scores now are very minimalistic. Hardly a mark in them. And I must say, I find that liberating as well.
Dear listeners and friends of this podcast, in the past, I have offered you the chance to have conducting lessons from myself via my Patreon page. Sadly, all of those places have now been taken, and until one of my 6 pupils unsubscribes, this offer no longer exists. You can, however, still benefit in every other way from subscribing to my Patreon page. I've written an article on score marking, a set of diaries from trips guest conducting abroad. I've started a series of articles on the art of programming, and I'm about to start a new series on string playing for non-string playing conductors. There's over 25 hours of interviews, including my latest one with the principal double bass of the Concertgebouw Orchestra and media personality Dominic Seldis. All of this is available at patreon.com/A Mic on the Podium, and from just £5 a month, you can gain access to this ever-growing resource on conductors and conducting. That's patreon.com. Details and links to the page are in the show notes attached to this episode. Now, the all-important 10 questions with my guest, Grant Llewellyn. Grant, it's 10 questions time, the questions that no conductor can avoid, if they appear on this podcast at least, and I always start with, what sound or noise do you love, and what sound or noise do you hate?
I'm thinking of musical noises, because there's a whole nature outside which I adore. But I think, especially now that I cannot play the cello anymore, there is nothing more thrilling than the sound of the cello. It's the most sonorous, beautiful instrument that you can imagine, and especially it's thrilling when you're playing it yourself, and this sound is literally coming from within, and I regret that more than anything, not being able to play anymore. And I suppose in a similar sort of way, the sound that I always have this abiding memory of hating was when I started the cello with these wonderful old spinster sisters in Tenby, south of that, in Pembrokeshire, teaching, and the younger sister who taught viola and violin was an absolute demon, and we had string classes every Saturday morning, and I remember being at one of these, and some of the violas and the violin started scratching away on their instruments the wrong side of the bridge, which is quite excruciating in itself, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the scream of horror from their violin teacher, who shrieks up the top of her voice, and that stays with me to this day. It's worse than playing the wrong side of the bridge.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I can imagine somebody's shriek. There's nothing quite so piercing as a human voice that goes right through you. Yeah.
Absolutely. And she was diminutive, this lady, and perhaps the fact that it was a female voice as well. And it was so high-pitched and excruciating.
If you had 24 hours free, what would you spend it doing?
Well, I would hope to be in Pembrokeshire, my home, and the family with me, because if ever we have free time, we always end up on the Glen Beach, just outside Saundersfoot, between Saundersfoot and Tenby. I grew up as a young boy within a stone's throw of this beautiful little cove. As I say, don't tell anybody about it.
I won't.
It's private, and when the tide comes in, you have it to yourself. There's a little cave there as well, and when the tide goes out, it's the perfect cricket pitch, soccer, rugby, you name it, rock pools. So it would be 24 hours on the Glen Beach in Saundersfoot with my kids.
Number 4, and I always enjoy the answers to this because we get to talk about our favourite conductor or conductors of yesteryear. Who would they be?
I've always had a sneaking suspicion that I would have liked very much the company of Pierre Monteux.
Mm.
And I say his company, but of course, supreme amongst that implies his musicianship. And I still haven't found a recording of anything that he does disappointing, whether it be Haydn, Mozart, or Stravinsky. The man just has, I think, a wonderful instinct for music making, and would undoubtedly be the most colourful of characters as well.
Well, it seems to be, maybe it's just me, and I haven't listened to enough of his recordings, but he seems to be mainly known and remembered these days for the, hours and hours and hours and hours of rehearsing for the world premiere of The Rite of Spring. But, that's my fault, and I should maybe listen to some more of his recordings, and I now will on the basis of your recommendation. But he's not a name that's come up in the past at all, I don't think, as an answer to that question, so thank you. Number 5 is somewhat harder. Sometimes people are repertoire specific about number 5. Sometimes it's just, workmen, the way they work in our profession and how much they admire them. And occasionally, as I've said, people refuse to answer the question. And the question for number 5 is, who would be your favorite current conductor or conductors?
Yeah, I can see why people refuse. It's a bit of a cop-out, but I would like to divide the answer between my mentors, who are still with us. So on the one hand, Seiji Ozawa, and when I mentioned John Elliott Gardner, he has been an inspiration, and the person whose recordings I perhaps most admire. So ever since school. And then shortly after school, of course, Simon Rattle in Birmingham. I was lucky to get quite close to Simon, and he's been, well, there's a good reason why the Berlin Philharmonic takes somebody and has been such a success. So in a sense, they are my 3 mentors, but I also have a tremendous time for the new generation, the younger generation of British conductors. It's a fact of life that conductors don't often meet each other. And I can't say that I've seen enough of the younger generation in concert, but I've heard broadcasts and been tremendously impressed. So I'm not going to name any names, but I think it's an exciting time for orchestras in this country.
Well, you've named 3 names who have been mentioned before. Simon Rattle, definitely, possibly more than anybody else. Ozawa, definitely. I think Bob Spano even had the same answer, and I'm not surprised. Of course, both of you spent years watching his every move. And John Elliott Gardner. And you're right, conductors do not meet each other very often at all, and it's one of the bonuses of this podcast for me is I've now met, 117 of you, and some of those people I've kept in touch with, and we've got on very well, and it's been a bonus because, as you say, unless you you go to one of their concerts or you bump into each other at an airport or a motorway service station, in transit, you just don't meet each other. And so, yeah, you're right. And the younger generation, you're absolutely right. It's just that there are some great conductors out there. So perfectly valid answers. What is the hardest work you've ever conducted?
Wow. Well, technically, I think I'm going to go for Leonard Bernstein's West Side Story, but not in a concert version, but in the film version, the original film version, with a live orchestra.
Live to the film. Yeah.
And that blew my brains out. It's one thing conducting the score and all its pitfalls, but it is another thing conducting it to the original screen. And the Jets and the Sharks do not always keep good time. To say nothing for Tony or Maria. And in fact, in the same sort of way, it was almost as difficult, but not so intricate a score, but accompanying Judy Garland when I did on The Wizard of Oz, in the same way. That you take an orchestra soundtrack out of the original and then try and put it back live. It is a fiend. I don't know. I think difficult in its own way would be Strauss's Metamorphosen, which I conducted at Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge. And it left me totally distraught and wiped out in a way that I don't think I've been with any other piece.
It's a very, very emotional piece to conduct. I've done it 2 or 3 times, and I've got it coming up again later this season in Finland. And also, I played it. I played first violin and 9th and 10th in my career, maybe 6th once as well, of the 10 violin parts. And it is, it's a tough piece. If you invest anything of yourself in it, it's tough. As for conducting live to film, I've done it once, and mine was nothing like as hard as yours. I was doing North by Northwest, the Herman score. I didn't have to mix with voices or, oh my God, that sounds incredibly, incredibly tough. I have a question 6A, which is really aimed at you because of you suffering your stroke. What was the first thing you conducted when you came back? And how hard was it for you to convince yourself that, yes, you could do it with one hand? What was the first concert that you did when you came back?
Well, the first project, because it was during the pandemic, so we were all in the studios recording everything that we could do, was a recording of the Haydn 3 early symphonies, 6, 7, 8, Matin, Midi, and Soir, with my orchestra in France. And I very quickly forgot that I had any handicap.
Brilliant.
Which was pleasing. I mean, I wasn't trying to forget, I just did. And that is the case to this day with audiences. If you can get me to the rostrum, then I'm away and I'm okay.
Well, I had to ask because, it must have felt a little bit like it did way back when, for all of us, when the first time you can practice in front of a mirror, you can practice with your eyes shut, you can practice with a score, you can practice conducting along to a CD if you want, but nothing prepares you for the first time you go out and do it with a live orchestra. And it must have felt the same when you first started to rehearse, just briefly. Thought I'm starting all over again.
Oh, I was terrified.
Mm.
And I'm still somewhat anxious, especially with a new orchestra, the first rehearsal. What does the management tell an orchestra? Oh, well, Grant is only able to use his left hand. I hope you can all follow. I don't think that is necessary anymore. People will realize during the course of the first rehearsal or not. And interestingly, there are quite a few members who just see me and it looks fairly natural, and so they don't question. Yeah, there are still things that I am learning to do better. You'd appreciate the beat patterns are a mirror of what the right hand did, and whenever they become more intricate, the subdivision, for instance, if you had to subdivide 12 with your left hand, you've got so many beats going that way, and then you've got a page turn in the middle of it, and there are some practical limitations which I'm working on. Literally, beating 5 and 7 and what have you is sometimes a challenge, but that's the least of our concerns, really. Beating. I try to be as clear as I possibly can without the baton, but they seem to be able to follow perfectly well.
When travelling abroad to conduct, what item could you not leave home without?
Now, I saw this on the crib sheet that you sent out, and it says in no uncertain terms, capital letters, you are not allowed to answer your mobile phone. And I applauded that when I saw that, way back when, pre all of this. And then I had a stroke, and suddenly the practical challenges of getting around airports, immigration, customs, especially with the pandemic, payment of any sort, research, internet, sound libraries, is a major challenge for me now. I just can't carry things, and so I'm going to break all of your rules, like. Sorry about this,
Grant, I will allow it, because I will allow it. Yeah.
I would not have been able to survive traveling under the pandemic with visas and tickets and passes and special permissions from the French government without this. It has absolutely been a lifeline for me. So please, may I make an exception?
You are allowed to have phone. I don't think I've allowed phone as an answer since, I don't know, episode 3 or 4. And the reason that's why I banned it, because I could see everybody giving the same answer. But I've not had anybody on who's had a stroke, who can only use one arm. And I will very much allow you to have that as an answer. Because, frankly, the rest of us have, with 2 hands, that's fine. For you, I can see to pay with your phone, to be able to access everything that you need with your phone. It's a lifeline that you can't live without, and therefore I fully and utterly allow it.
You're very gracious.
What is the one thing you would change about being a conductor?
I think in this day and age, I would change the ability to fly transatlantic and conduct the next morning, whether you're in Europe or in the United States. It's possible, and I've done it far too often. And I would like to bring back ocean liners. In fact, one of the great perks of conducting in Brittany is that I take Brittany ferries to work. And it's an overnight trip on a ferry with a cabin, very comfortable. You wake up in St. Malo or Roscoff, and you've got a short drive, and then rehearsals the day after. But I always leave a good day in between to recover, because traveling, it takes its toll. And the number of times I've flown in to a city, to an orchestra, jet-lagged, strung out, and overtired, and force myself through an engagement. It's not healthy.
No. I remember Andrew Litton in episode, I can't remember if it's called the 1 or 2, but the first episode talked about his time when he was traveling from Dallas to Bergen and the other way back around, and landing and then rehearsing the very next morning with no day off. I did it once. I got bumped off a flight from Heathrow to Buenos Aires and had to go the next day. I was put on the next day's flight, which meant that I landed at sort of like 7:30 in the morning, and I had a rehearsal at 10 o'clock the same morning in Buenos Aires. Now, that wasn't my fault. That was British Airways' fault for dumping me off the plane. But I've never conducted a rehearsal feeling so goddamn awful in my life. And no, you're right. When you can maybe do that once in a blue moon, but if you're doing that regularly, and once every 2 weeks or once a month, or it catches up on you. And so I think, building a day off is absolutely paramount, but also try and avoid traveling that far anyway. But yeah.
I mean, incidentally, they never were able to find a cause for my stroke. I've had every test in the book and everything seems fine, which is reassuring in one sense, but on the other hand, it would be nice to know. And, 30 years of transatlantic flights won't have helped.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt or have liked to have attempted in the past?
I toyed with the sensible answer to this, which would have been a teacher of some sort. But the profession which I'm most intrigued by, had I pursued it, would have been professional footballer.
Ah, you mentioned you played football professionally, I'm assuming to some degree in Italy when you were there for a year.
It was sort of semi-professional in Italy, but they paid quite well. I played at Cambridge and to a reasonable level, at which point music took over really. But watching a lot of football as I do, had I been made to work at some areas of my game, you always wonder whether you would have survived in the Tottenham midfield. I was pretty good in the air. I think I read the game quite well. A midfield role was my preferred position. Probably headed the ball too often. Come to think of the stroke now. But no, I don't know. I'll never know. But you asked the question, and it was a sometime dream of mine.
And the final question, Grant, is my favourite of all. If the world were to end tonight, what would be your choice of final meal and drink?
Oh gosh, I think I would keep it simple. Frankly, if this world is going to end, I don't want to end with a full stomach. So I think I would go with something from my garden, because I enjoy gardening, and I'd probably go for the pimientos de padron. Do you know these green peppers?
I do, padron peppers, yes.
Which are absolutely delicious when roasted with a bit of olive oil and salt. And if I could have a plate of my own pimientos and a glass of dry white wine, I don't know, Chablis or something, I would be in heaven. So it's very cheap for you if you're providing this, but just a glass of Chablis and a bowl of pimientos, and let the world go to hell in a basket, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I haven't offered to pay, but thank you for keeping it cheap. I mean, compared to Leonard Slatkin's, which, with the flights, the wine list and the food, I mean, it cost me about 10,000 quid. Yeah, thank you for keeping it cheap. But as a lover of Padron peppers, and it was actually Alistair Malloy, the percussionist and presenter, who introduced me to those on one of our many trips to Liverpool. I love them. I think they're wonderful, and we have them at home. And wonderful it's been chatting to you, Grant. It's been educative. It's been informative. It's been touching. And I've really, really enjoyed chatting to you. And I hope very soon that I can meet up with you. And I will buy the peppers and the wine if we do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's been a pleasure.
A Mic on the Podium was devised and produced by Michael Seal, with music by Ben Dawson. Next time, I chat with a conductor whose early career was as the founder of a world-famous string quartet. After retiring as a violinist, he has had a very successful career, with title positions in Switzerland, Hungary, the Republic of Ireland, the United Kingdom, and his native Hungary. But until then, bye-bye.